Atma Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Pranic Healing Podcast. Today, we have an amazing and exciting episode where we're going to be talking about the science of meditation. And our esteemed guest speaker today is none other than Jeff Tarrant. Jeff holds a PhD and also is a board-certified neurofeedback therapist. He is the founder and director of Psychic Mind Science and the NeuroMeditation Institute in Eugene, Oregon. Jeff is also a licensed psychologist, and his research focuses on exploring brainwave changes that occurs as a result of meditation practices using different technologies. And of course, Jeff has done a lot of amazing research in pranic healing and twin hearts meditation as well. So please welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. As I mentioned before the podcast, I was a big fan of yours and still a big fan of yours now. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity to speak with you now at present. And I just wanted to kind of let the audience kind of dive deep into your world. How did you being a scientist and, almost like a consciousness explorer, how did you kind of get started? Because this is definitely not the traditional way of doing science and research. So I'm very curious.
Yeah. So let me ask a clarifying question. Are you talking specifically with kind of pranic healing or Hatha yoga, or with meditation in general, or what?
Yeah, I would say both. Both. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I actually got started and interested in meditation, a pretty long time ago, maybe 25, 26 years ago, something like that. And really, I had no idea at the time what I was even thinking about, or I think I like the mystery of meditation at that point. I lived in the Midwest in the United States. It wasn't like there was a lot of meditation happening at that point. There certainly wasn't anywhere to learn meditation. So it was almost like this mysterious thing that I was kind of like, ooh, what is this? What is this meditation thing? And the idea that somehow it can help unlock aspects of consciousness. I think that's what attracted me to it. And so, of course, when you put something out there in the universe, things tend to show up. And so found a Qigong group and started practicing Qigong, found a Zen teacher in the middle of my small town in Missouri and started sitting with him. And so really, I mean, it's just been kind of an ongoing process from then. One of the things that I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, maybe it's neither, is I've had this tendency to explore lots of different things. I'm not particularly great at picking one style or one approach, and that's my thing. I've got more of a habit of, I'm going to check this out for a while. And then when I feel like I've kind of learned what I need from that, then I move on to something else and incorporate it all into what I'm doing. So I think that's got its pluses and minuses, right? But and that's kind of what happened with the pranic healing and Arhatic yoga. Was I actually had no idea what any of this was. And I was teaching at the University of Missouri at the time, and I was teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction, which most people are familiar with. It's an 8-week semi-structured group that is based loosely on meditative practices and, but for a Western audience. And so I was teaching this to students at the university, and one of the people that signed up for the class happened to be a pranic healer and was involved in Arhatic yoga. And so, she kept kind of coming in and pestering me and saying, hey, we should do some research on this thing. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I had no idea what pranic healing was. I'm like, is it some sort of breath work thing, like prana? At the time I was busy, I had no interest. And she kind of kept at it. She kept, she'd wait a month and then come and talk to me again. And then she'd wait a couple of months and come and talk to me again. And finally, she convinced me to do a little study. And that was intriguing. We did a little study looking at energy healing, pranic healing, and measuring brainwave activity during that process. And so from there, as I started to get more curious about it, did more research, took the first few pranic healing classes, level 1, level 2, the psychotherapy, did the preparatory Arhatic training. So, kind of started exploring that myself. So it's an ongoing exploration, I guess.
Yeah. Well, acted like a true chronic healer. It kind of nags you every couple of months. And I know a lot of people like myself that tend to do that with certain projects and things here and there. But I'm glad that it worked out that way because, like you mentioned, you did some really interesting studies on, twin hearts meditation and of course pranic healing. And it's such an interesting journey that you've kind of went on because I think for a lot of people, even if we say we practice energy healing or spirituality, meditation is really like diving into the darkness, if you will. It's like how they say in Taoism, it's the darkness in which you have to go through until you find the light or enlightenment. Now, when you talk about meditation, Jeff, and you talk about brain waves, can you share and help the audience understand, like, what are you looking at when you're trying to study meditation? Because it seems like it's for us looking in, it's like, oh, what can you be looking at? Because for us, it's just our eyes are closed and it's just a dark mind and silent emotions. But what are you looking at?
Yeah, so the type of brain imaging that I use is an EEG. So it's measuring the electrical activity of the brain. And so we use a cap that has 19 electrodes. So we can measure 19 areas of the brain simultaneously. And so what we're looking at really is the different frequencies of electricity that the brain is producing, because brain waves are complicated. You got slow brain waves, you got fast brain waves. It's a little bit like the light spectrum. You've got red light and blue light and yellow light, and they're different frequencies. Well, the brain is kind of the same way, but we refer to it as delta, theta, alpha, beta. These different names for brain waves are different frequencies. So it's the colors of the spectrum, and then looking to see, well, how much of each of those are present. So how much delta is there, how much theta, how much gamma, whatever we're looking at. And the reason that's interesting is because different brain waves are associated with different states of consciousness. And so what we can do is we can look at specific parts of the brain and specific brain waves, and then start to understand, well, what's actually happening here? Besides how people feel, which is important, obviously, and we understand this from a neurological standpoint. Like, what's happening in the brain? Why are these practices so beneficial from a physiological nervous system perspective? And so for me, that's where I have a lot of fun, is looking at the differences between different practices and trying to understand, well, which types of meditation might be better for different concerns. So helping people identify which practices and approaches might be best for their individual needs.
Mm. And as a practitioner, I'm an acupuncturist and I'm also a naturopathic physician. I always try to personalize my treatment protocols based on the individual's specific constitution and unique needs. And that resonates with me so much because, like you said, meditation is such a big umbrella term for so many other different types of practices. And I know, you're part of a couple of institutions, right? So I know you're part of the NeuroMeditation Institute and also part of the Psychic Mind Science organization as well. And can you talk to us a little bit about those two and how is that what you mean by using different modalities and or forms of meditation to help people understand and sort of address their concerns or whatever they're looking for?
Yeah, sure. And most of that really falls under the neuromeditation umbrella of work that I do, because really that's what we're doing is we're identifying, and not just our research, but all of the research that's been done by everyone, that's in this field over the last, especially 30 years. There's been so much data about the brain and meditative states. And so using what we know to say, okay, there's a way to categorize meditation practices so that we can help people figure out which approaches are going to help best with different mental health concerns. And that's my particular interest because I'm a psychologist. And so if somebody's concerned about anxiety, are there particular approaches that are likely to help more? If somebody's concerned about trauma or PTSD, are there ways that we can engage with meditation that are likely to reduce those symptoms and not cause additional problems? Because of course, for some people with a trauma history, when they try to meditate, it actually stirs things up and it makes things worse. So exploring that, like, what is the intersection between the brain, mental health, and meditation? And how can we use what we know to make this process more user friendly? Because it's kind of a mess out there, right? You look at, like you said, meditation is such a huge umbrella term, and it encompasses everything. And it's like, well, for your average person, that's not going to help much, right? Because it's like, well, what should I do? Where do I go? And so that we've just tried to make it more practical. And it's a very Western approach. Get it? My old Zen teacher would probably not be happy with kind of what I've decided to do.
Why?
Well, because he was a Rinzai monk, and his approach was very much like, stop talking about it and just sit and be quiet, right? Like that was the message. And
Mm.
so if I asked questions, you know, that was usually the response. Sit more. Like, stop asking questions, stop thinking about this, and just meditate. And I understand from that tradition that approach. But from where I'm coming from, the vast majority of people, at least in the United States, are not going to do that. If you just say, just keep sitting, just keep meditating, and you'll figure it out. And it's like, well, most people aren't going to do that.
No, as someone that's been practicing meditation about 10 years, I don't know if I can do that, longer than 10 minutes still. I have still things I'm working through. But, I'm really curious, Jeff, because speaking about approaches, I think this is what kind of defines your work. Because with meditation, there's so many routes and avenues. And like you mentioned with your Zen meditation teacher, there's like this one process that underlies the practice. But how did you kind of come to identify, it seems like, the four different styles of meditation within the framework of neuromeditation? What are the kind of the key differences between them? Because I find that unique, because like you said, this is more of an approach or a framework that you're building for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. So the four styles that we talk about usually, we've labeled focus, mindfulness, open heart, and quiet mind. And those categories came really from all that research that's been done out there, identifying that, in general, most meditations can be put into one of those categories. And it has to do with how you're directing your attention and what your intention is, which then, of course, affects which brain waves are engaged and where. So, focus practices are those practices that everybody's familiar with, putting your attention on your breath or a mantra or an image of the Buddha or whatever, holding your attention there. Your mind wanders, you bring it back. There's lots of ways to do that, but they all have that in common, that idea of holding your attention on a single thing. So because of that, the brain pretty much acts the same, whether you're doing mantra practice or visualization or whatever. Mindfulness, that's a little bit of a loaded term right now because it could mean everything out there under the sun, depending on how people are using it. We're using it in a very specific way to talk about practices where you are shifting into an observer mode and simply allowing whatever is happening, whether it's a thought or a feeling or a body sensation, to be present without attachment to it, without turning it into a story. So it's almost kind of the bare awareness. So just being aware of what's happening, but without adding anything to it. So again, there's a lot of ways to do that, but you're using your attention differently than focus. So it affects the brain differently. Open heart, it's kind of obvious, right? But practices that are more loving kindness, compassion. So to a large degree, twin hearts fits into this category. Although I'd like to come back to that because twin hearts is an interesting, actually, combination of a lot of these. So, loving kindness, compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, a lot of those types of practices where you're activating a positive emotional state and then doing something with it. That's kind of the open heart. And then quiet mind, again, kind of obvious, where there's a minimal amount of internal chatter, where you're kind of relaxing the attention. So instead of paying attention to something in particular, it's kind of like that nothingness or that emptiness or the spaciousness. So those are kind of the four primary states. Now there's other things that can happen as well, but those four seem to be the biggies. And that show up a lot.
Hey, well, thank you for explaining all those. I mean, I definitely learned something new. I, didn't realize there these sort of four teamworks to meditation. You explained it so clearly. So if I'm getting it right, it's focused attention, the heart, and then there's the quiet mind, and then what's the other one? The second one?
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness, right. I was so mindful of you talking, I did not objectively put that into my definition of my brain. Right,
Yeah.
mindfulness. Yeah, very cool. And, speaking of that, you mentioned Twin Hearts meditation, which is the staple meditation we practice in pranic healing, is a combination of both. And I know you've done an amazing study on it as well. So can you explain a little bit how that, the practice of Twin Hearts is a combination of all those styles? And, specifically with that study you did, it sounded like there was a lot of interesting data that came about from that practice.
Yeah. And so, I've used a couple of different recorded versions of Twin Hearts meditation for research purposes. And one of the ways that we looked at it was because, of course, when I started doing that meditation myself, and I was aware of this other framework, I was like, oh, wait a minute. There's an invocation at the beginning. Okay, that's one thing. And there's the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. Okay, that's kind of an open heart kind of a thing. And then there's the Twin Hearts aspect. Again, kind of open heart, right? You're connecting to certain positive emotional states. You're sending that to planet Earth, to all the people on planet Earth, all the places where their people are suffering. So that's all very in alignment with kind of an open heart practice, which is what I assumed the whole thing was, right? But then, of course, there's the oming part where you're oming, and it's like, oh, well, wait a minute, that's a little bit more like a focus practice, right? You have it's kind of like the beginning of transcendental meditation, where you're focused on a single thing. Of course, there's a trick, right? Because the way that Master guides it, he also says, pay attention to the stillness in between the sounds, which is, by the way, genius, because what's happening there is that you're kind of interweaving that focus and quiet mind. So it's a little bit of this mix of going back and forth between focusing on one thing, the Om, focusing on no things, focusing on one thing, focusing on no things, which is a really clever way to get people into that state, because it's really hard for most of us to just empty our minds. But if you only have to do it for a second, and then there's something else that you can pay attention to, it's a much easier transition. Then there's the silence, quiet mind, right? And then we sort of come back out of the meditation. So I didn't talk about mindfulness, but of course there's elements of mindfulness kind of woven throughout. But at a bare minimum, it's very clear where you can see the open heart, the quiet mind, and the focus elements kind of blended in there. And so in some ways, I feel like what Twin Hearts does is it's a nice integration of these different styles. So you're kind of getting a little bit, you're getting the benefit, I think, of multiple styles rather than just focusing on one.
Yeah, I mean thank you for explaining that, because now it makes so much sense to me now that you've explained the four, meditation frameworks, and seeing how Twin Hearts, yeah, I've never thought about that. It's the quiet mind, and then the focused attention, and the mindfulness, but then the open heart. So wow, that's something new that I learned today. So I mean, it sounds pretty complicated to study all those four parts, if I'm not, because I've read the study and I'm like, oh man, I think I'm following along, but there are some key points that you brought up in the study which I'm very interested, because it seems like different parts had a different effect on the brainwave activity. Can you kind of describe that for us? Because a lot of people are looking into the science of meditation, but especially with Twin Hearts, we practice that so much, and I think it would help the audience learn more about what they're practicing.
Sure, yeah. And I'm currently in the middle of another study with Twin Hearts, which I'm still collecting the data, so I can't report anything from that study just yet. Still working on it. But the study that we did previously, we collected data. I think it was like 12 experienced Arhatic yoga practitioners who had been doing Twin Hearts. I think we said, at least 5,000 hours of practice. So if you think about that, that's a lot of Twin Hearts meditation. And then we had a group of another 12 people that basically don't meditate at all, ever. any tradition. So novice meditators and sort of experts had them, we measured their brainwave activity and at baseline before they did anything, during the guided meditation, guided twin hearts, and measured their brainwaves afterward. And what was interesting is because of this, the way that Twin Hearts is set up, where there's kind of these little sections, these little segments of the meditation, I actually went into, I'm glad I kind of thought of this because it ended up being very interesting, but it was a lot of work. But so to go into each EEG file and separate the EEG into those time segments for each of the little pieces of the meditation. Really what I focused on was gamma brainwave activity. I wanted to see, well, how does gamma change for each of these little segments? If it's the invocation versus twin hearts versus silence, whatever. And the reason I chose gamma was for two reasons. Gamma is the fastest brainwave that we usually work with. It's usually between 35 and 50 hertz, something like that. So it's very fast. So it's associated with activation. So when gamma shows up, that part of the brain is active, but it's also associated with kind of expanded states of consciousness, as well as kind of being in the flow. So being in a state without working too hard to get there. So, you see it show up with experts in various ways because they can tune in without over efforting. So anyway, I chose gamma to look at. And what we saw was, in fact, that the experienced meditators did show a really dramatic increase of gamma in specific parts of the brain throughout the entire Twin Hearts meditation, but it varied. It was stronger with the open heart aspects. So Twin Hearts meditation, Prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, those parts, it was the strongest. And then not surprisingly, during things like the oming and the quiet part, that gamma dropped significantly, which makes sense. And then it kind of perks back up again at the end, as you're sort of giving thanks and coming out of the meditation. What was interesting was that when we looked at the control group, so the novice meditators, they showed kind of a similar pattern at the beginning. So there was this increase of gamma at the beginning, not as dramatic as the experienced meditators, but it was there. But then once you got to the more silent part of the meditation, the gamma just disappeared. It just completely went away. And my theory is that, these are inexperienced meditators, and that once they kind of got past the initial part and they got to oming and the silence, they just kind of spaced out. Like their brain just kind of, they couldn't stay with the meditation. They just kind of got into a spacey la la land, which, might be pleasant, but it's not really the point of the meditation. So I think part of what we were seeing is that experienced meditators have learned how to engage with the meditation the way that it's designed. And that may take a little bit of practice. If you're new to meditation, it may take a second to learn how to sort of hold that space for an extended period. And the areas of the brain that showed up the strongest with this gamma activation, there was two areas, but I think the one that was the most interesting for me was the right insula. And it's a deeper brain structure in the right temporal lobe that has to do a lot with two things. It has a lot to do with awareness of your internal state. So, kind of a mindfulness kind of a thing. It also has a lot to do with emotions and activation of emotions. And so to me, that was really interesting that right insula lit up the way that it did with the experienced meditators in particular. So clearly something is happening, right? You're engaging, you're exercising these brain regions in a really powerful way. So to me, it's not a big surprise. Like when I went to I was just recently at the spiritual vacation in New York with Pastor Glenn and that group. And every time I'm with those groups, I'm always surprised sort of how kind and gentle and peaceful and loving everybody is. And so to me, it's like, is that because of what's happening with this meditation? That, not just that, right? But it, like you said, it is kind of one of the core practices. And so is there something about that you're exercising these regions over and over and over and over again, that it becomes kind of automatic? It becomes just kind of a natural part of who you are and how you operate. To me, that makes sense. I mean, don't know that for sure, but it makes some logical sense.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like almost like working out at a gym. It's like a muscle memory, but you're working out your brain, it sounds like. And I know there's a lot of studies how, experienced meditators, there are certain regions of their brain in terms of their gray matter and white matter, it's actually more dense and it's younger than people equivalents that don't meditate for their age. And it's really exciting that you mentioned these things, especially with Twin Hearts meditation, because I think the practice of most meditation from the foundation of all, it is like the sense of compassion and understanding who you are and through your thoughts and your emotions and being able to share that compassion throughout the world. I think that's a core theme of most traditional meditation practices. But I find it so interesting that you mentioned the gamma waves, right? So it sounds like when we're in that gamma wave state, you mentioned we're in a state of flow where things just come very easy. And I think about like sports players when they're in their top game, right? It's like they're hitting on all cylinders, they're making all the shots. That's so cool that we can kind of sort of experience that just being our average non-athletic versions of ourselves in different ways. So I'm very curious, Jeff, based on what you've studied on Twin Hearts meditation and through your extensive experience studying meditation, like what have you seen in terms of practical outcomes? I know you're a psychologist, in terms of your clients and your patients, because it sounds like meditation is as potent as a therapy or even like a drug without a drug to many people, but it's really helping through your work, helping them understand that yes, even though this is something not physical, not tangible, it is something that can tremendously benefit your health in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, because my background and my work I do is as a psychologist. So, most of the people that I work with, yeah, they're dealing with some kind of, anxiety, depression, whatever, cognitive difficulties, trauma response. And absolutely, I would say that meditation can help with all of those things. Now, the caveat that I'll put in there is, it depends, right? Like everybody's different. And there are some people, even though my office is called the NeuroMeditation Institute, and people know that this is what I do, and sometimes they're coming to me specifically because of that. But there are times where somebody will come in and I'll say, yeah, you know what, meditation is, we're not ready for that yet. Uh, there are times where people are struggling significantly and we need to do some other work first, and then we can add the meditation. And so I see it as, for a lot of people, and thinking of it in the context of mental health, as kind of an adjunct or a supplement. Now, when people are starting to function pretty well and they're doing okay, then I feel like meditation can kind of take over as maybe the primary approach. But the other thing that I would add is that for me, it's important to think about meditation, what we're doing with meditation, beyond sitting on the cushion or sitting on the chair, right? I think a lot of people see meditation as, oh, I do my 15 minutes in the morning, I sit on my cushion, watch my breath or whatever I do, and that's it. And for me, it's like, well, wait a minute. Don't you want to carry those effects into your day? How can you be more aware of yourself, be non-reactive, be more open-hearted and compassionate, allow the mind to be more still? How can you do all of that during the day? And I think that's really where the power is. And so helping, you know, the meditation in the morning or whatever is kind of like the going to the gym. Yeah, that's great. You need to exercise that muscle, but then how do we carry it with us? And so I feel like that's a really important aspect that often gets missed. And again, I think that's one of the things that is so powerful about Arhatic yoga, right? It's a lifestyle. It's not necessarily just, oh, do this meditation, then do this meditation, and you're done. It's like, no. It's like, how do you live? How do you live your life? And I think that's the key, right? To really getting the most from any kind of meditation practice.
Yeah, I think I've identified a great and common misconception about meditation, which is like, oh yeah, I'll just meditate for these 5 minutes and 5 minutes of stress free that I'll only have for this day, or, for that period of time. It's really, I go back to, it's like when you're working out your body, right? When you're working out your muscles, you're not only getting those benefits during the actual workout, it's throughout the day, and it's a practice, and you continue, and that's how you have growth. And I'm really glad you brought that up, Jeff, because I find that's a common misconception about meditation in general. And like you mentioned with Master Choa's teaching, he was always about practicality, right, and applying this into your everyday life. So you can, like Twin Hearts, just go with the flow, and if things come up, you'll be able to manage it better. So thank you for bringing that up. More of a personal question, and it's something that I've been really interested. I'm sure you've heard of heart brain coherence and from the Heart Math Institute. And I've always been curious because Twin Hearts, we're literally focusing on the heart and the crown chakras, which is the heart and the brain. Have you thought about because I have, like, the parallels or the connections there? Because the heart also is an amazing individual organ itself, but it has its own electrical activity. Can you share sort of your insights on that? Because I've always been interested after hearing about heart-brain coherence.
Sure. I mean, I can share what I know, right? Certainly I'm familiar with that concept, and I use heart maths equipment. I've used it forever, and there's other ways that we can measure. Really what they're measuring is something called heart rate variability. And without getting too technical, the heart makes different frequencies just like the brain does. And there's a communication between the heart and the brain, obviously. And so it makes sense that there are going to be certain states of consciousness or feeling, whatever we want to call it, where that heart and brain communication is perfectly in sync with each other. And so you can measure the heart, and you can measure these frequencies, and you can get a sense of kind of, well, what's happening with the heart field? Because it's an electromagnetic field, and that extends out, right? It's not just in your heart. It extends out away from the body. You can actually measure it like 6 feet away from the body. You can measure the heart field, which is interesting, right? Because obviously what that means is that we're in each other's heart fields, literally all day long. Anytime you're sort of within somebody's bubble.
Is that what we call the aura?
It may have something to do with that, right? It may be an aspect of the electromagnetic aspect of the aura is kind of this heart frequency. The heart is much stronger in terms of electromagnetic frequencies than the brain even. And so anyway, yeah, there's this communication going back and forth, and we can measure that, and we can measure how coherent that is. That's the term that they like to use. The tricky part with that is that the way that the heart behaves is so influenced by our breathing that it's almost difficult to separate out, well, what if somebody just slows their breathing down and the breathing gets nice and smooth? Well, everything gets into balance all of a sudden. And it's like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean you're meditating, right? I mean, you might be, but so it gets complicated. But we also know that positive emotional states bring it into balance. So even though I haven't measured this specifically, I would not be shocked at all if Twin Hearts meditation increases coherence significantly, because things like appreciation, gratitude, love, compassion, all of those things increase that heart-brain coherence. And that's exactly what we're doing in that practice.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I have been so curious about that since I've ever looked into, the heart-brain coherence framework, and looking at HRV, like you mentioned. And it's quite interesting, right? Like you mentioned, like breathing is another wrench to the whole system, because that can be automatic, or that can be voluntary in how we choose to breathe, and similar to how we think and feel. But it's quite fascinating how there's so many different frameworks and perspectives we can look at this. So it's something so exciting on my part, because I just love learning about this. And it's like you mentioned, it's learning about the unknown, and being a consciousness explorer, and seeing the depths of human potential, and sort of making sense of things here and now. Well, it's been such a lovely conversation, Jeff. I really appreciate your time, and I know I could talk to you for another couple of hours. In terms of, I know you have some amazing research coming up too, studying on Twin Hearts meditation again. But where can people find you and look you up or get more information about your amazing work and the things that you do and offer?
Yeah, we've got a couple of websites depending on what people are interested in. There's the, neuromeditationinstitute.com. So, is going to be more oriented toward a lot of what we were discussing, meditation in the brain and mental health, different classes and programs and things that are available. The other website is psychicmindscience.com. And there's some overlap between what happens there, but that's more looking at what's happening in the brain during more extraordinary states. So whether it's healing or psychic type experiences or mediumship, whatever it might be. And then, kind of the same idea, like how do we use that information to enhance those abilities? And so, in fact, a little plug for my most recent book. So I had a book that came out a little bit less than a year ago, and it's called Becoming Psychic. And there's a chapter in there where I actually talk about some of the research with the pranic healing and, looking at some of the brainwave changes and activity that happened in our little study that we did with pranic healing and comparing that to some other types of energy work. So that may be something that would potentially also be of interest to some of the listeners here.
Very cool, and always interested in that too, with the framework of energy healing, energy medicine, meditation. I find that such a complement to each other, and I feel like that should be another podcast episode, just diving deep into the science of what I call it. Is it called parapsychology, right? Or just sort of beyond the normal, if you will. So yes, really interested and excited, and I will leave all of Jeff's information down below in the description as well. Before I let you go, Jeff, I ask this question to all my guests. What's sort of like the best advice that you've heard for, people on the path of meditation? Like, what is something that, someone has told you and you remember that really resonates with you and kind of, inspires your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Depending on what day or week you ask me that question, I might have a different answer. The thing that's really been standing out for me personally lately is this, we kind of mentioned it earlier, but this concept of non-efforting. And I feel like to a large degree, this is the key. And not just to meditation, but also to healing. That to a certain degree, if you try too hard, you're actually getting in the way. You're actually inhibiting the process. So both the healing and meditation, it's kind of like, can you find the felt state, the felt sense of what you're trying to do, and then just relax into it? Like, you don't have to try that hard. And this is a piece of wisdom. I don't remember where, I've heard it a million times, but I'm still trying to incorporate. That's probably why it's on my mind. Because again, it's one of those Western things. We want something, we want a certain feeling or a state or attentional awareness. And so we feel like we have to try. I have to try to get there. And that's true to some degree, but it's like, it needs to be gentle. It needs to be soft and kind of balanced. And so anyway, that would be the one little piece that I would encourage people to work with, is see if you can find that ability. It's more of a feeling. What is the feeling? And then can you just relax into that? You don't have to try so hard.
Yeah. Wow. Very profound, Jeff. I think the audience has to listen to that part more than once. Just myself, I'm thinking about it, and it really reminds me of what we talked about. When your brain is in that gamma wave state, right? Everything is just flowing through you, and like we mentioned, when athletes are in that gamma state, they're not even trying. It's like whatever they do, it's automatically gonna make that shot, go in the goal, whatever. It's happening, and they move so effortlessly. It's like
Yep.
it's like a master class. And I think what you're describing to us as average people in whatever we do in life, whether it's in work, family, relationships, we can also be in that state no matter what type of activity or practice we're doing. So it's so amazing because I find it combines the best of both worlds, right? It's just like flow state, allowing things to happen, right? But also the intention of it, which is just carrying that out through the day, through your life. Amazing advice there. So thank you so much, Jeff. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm sure we will have to link up and schedule a next podcast for more of your work and studies there. But for our audience, again, I will leave Jeff's information down below if you want to reach out and attend his courses and offerings and things like that. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pranic Healing Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review down below. And that's it for today. Namaste, take care, and we will see you in the next episode.